Hello and welcome back to another Giant Slayer TFT Top 10 video. Today we're going to be going over 10 items you should consider using in patch 1017. We'll be going over items with potential to do well in the meta, as well as returning items that are still worth using. Keep in mind that some of these items are based on speculation on what the meta is going to be, so they may not all end up being worthwhile after players get used to the new patch. With all that said, let's jump on in. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come, so be sure to also follow our Giant Slayer TFT social media pages. Alright, let's get back into the video, and starting off the top of our list, we have Dragon's Claw coming in as the number 10 item. For quite a long time now, the cloak component has had the lowest value compared to other components. In fact, getting early double cloaks has often been seen as a low roll and puts you behind drastically. While that still may be the case, at least in this upcoming meta, having double cloak may open up the possibility of running a Dragon's Claw. But why Dragon's Claw? Mainly due to the amount of magic damage that we've been seeing in the past few metas. Having a Dragon's Claw on a frontliner or your main carry can keep them alive much longer. Consider the amount of builds that have strong magic damage in them. Rebels have not only Gangplank, but Ziggs, Aurelion Sol, and even the rockets from Jinx. Star Guardian Sorcerer is entirely about magic damage, with Syndra as the carry and Nico doing AoE damage in the frontline. Ever heard of Mech? Victor is a key champion for that build, not to mention that the super mech itself does good spell damage. Even Astro Sniper, which is a split between both types of damage, has a lot of magic damage between the frontline and Teemo. Basically, we're not advocating that you grab as many cloaks as you can and spam Dragon's Claw. We're simply saying that, hey, in the case that the game gives you several cloaks, try out a Dragon's Claw as it has potential value in the meta. Next up, we have another defensive item coming in at number 10, Bramble Vest. Where Dragon Claw is strong against magic damage, we have the opposite in that, which is Bramble Vest. Bramble Vest is meant to be used on frontline champions to help mitigate damage, specifically by negating the extra damage of critical strikes, as well as providing armor on top of it, and it has a bit of AoE damage as well. You may be thinking that we just said that the meta is focused more on magic damage, so what's the point of using an armor item like Bramble Vest? The answer to that depends on how the meta shapes up. Currently, we're still seeing a good amount of Cybernetics and Astro Sniper. Whether those builds remain popular, we'll have to see, but Bramble Vest is meant to help against those types of builds because of champions like Jhin, Vayne, and Aurelia are heavily focused on physical damage and critical damage. Bramble Vest helps any frontliner survive longer against any of those champions. It also helps weaker frontline champions just live longer. For example, Nico can often struggle to stay alive long enough as the main frontline for Star Guardian Sorcerer. Giving her a defensive item like Bramble Vest can help keep her alive long enough to get a few casts of her abilities. Basically, look to give it to non-Vanguard champions that struggle against heavy physical damage, although it's also still really good on Vanguards. Our last point has to do with the mech. Yes, it's receiving a hotfix, so maybe mech will fall out of the meta, but if it remains strong enough, having a Bramble Vest on the super mech is insanely good. So if you're looking for two default defensive items that are all around useful against meta builds, try out Bramble Vest or Dragon's Claw. Up next, we have Shroud of Stillness as the number 8 item. Shroud of Stillness may have received a nerf in 1016, but it's still doing well and still played frequently. The main reason is that the effect of the item, which increased the mana of the champion it hits, is incredibly valuable in a meta that focuses a lot on caster units. The effect of the item is good against any champion with mana, but it's really good against units that have already high base mana pools. For example, Janna and Gangplank have larger mana pools because their ultimates are crazy good. Shroud will make both of them take much longer to cast and thus lower their value in a fight. Gangplank does circumvent this a bit by being in the front line, but Janna can often to cast even once during a fight due to a Shroud. We will point out that due to the nerf, you may only want one of these items if you're given the option. In previous metas, you can make 2 or even 3, but after the nerf, it's less worthwhile to do so. Before we move on, the last point to talk about is that the dodge chance helps the mech quite a bit. So if the mech still plays a role in the meta, it inherently increases the value of Shroud. Moving along, we have Hextech Gunblade coming in at number 7. Alright, so Gunblade is definitely a niche item. The requirements for it are that the champion you place it on primarily needs to do high magic damage, preferably AoE, and be able to cast frequently. Otherwise, the item's healing and overhealing effect isn't going to help that much. Luckily, the meta is still in a place where it's going to get champions that fulfill those requirements. At the top, there's Jace. Jace is a staple frontline champion for a lot of builds, and Gunblade is amazing on him due to his AoE. Plus, he'll cast often as he's a frontline unit. Another two champions you can put the item on are Rumble and Ziggs. Both of them use it well, and you can sell them later to give it to Aurelion Sol. Lastly, there's a champion that got buffed in 1017 that may make a return to glory, and that's Riven. Generally, you want a death cap on her as your ability power item, but Gunblade may be a good choice as well. The initial aspect of her ability won't do anything for it, but the big AoE she does at the end should heal her for a lot. Overall, we can't say Hextech Gunblade is always worth playing, but it does have certain circumstances where it's valuable. Zzrot Portal is next and is coming in at the number 6 spot on today's list. This item has been on the fringe for a while in terms of value. There was a time where it was being played often, but since then it's become the type of item that you make if you happen to have the components for it. Despite that, it's an item with really good potential because it adds health to your front line. Not necessarily to the unit you give it to, but the construct that it spawns upon the unit's death has an absurd amount of health. Even if the champion is just a 1-star, the health of the construct is a whopping 1500. That is a lot, especially early on in the game. At tier 2, it's 2250 health. Again, that's a lot. So why hasn't it been that valued in the meta? A big reason is that the front line for a lot of compositions hasn't really needed it. Vanguards in particular have enough health and defensive qualities that you don't really need a Zzrot on them. But the meta may be in a place that Zzrot does well. Basically builds with weaker front lines where you aren't able to run Vanguards or 4 Brawlers. Star Guardian Sorcerer, for example, has a pretty weak front line. Look to use Zzrot in those types of builds, and even if you're not going for those builds, it's still a really effective early game item. Next up, we have Chalice of Power as the number 5 item. Chalice of Power, or as players often call it, the ice cream cone, hasn't really done that well in TFT. There's been a few times where it was valuable, but in general, it's fallen relatively flat. One reason is that positioning around a static item like this can be difficult, as it's easier for other players to play against it than it is for you to maneuver around them properly. Another reason is simply due to the lack of magic damage carries for a few patches. But, and we're sounding a bit like a broken record here, the meta is in a place where there's quite a few backline carries that are focused on magic damage. There's Victor, Syndra, Teemo, and either Ziggs or Aurelion Sol, just to name a few of the popular choices. Xerath is even another option, as he was buffed in 1017. Keep in mind that we're not suggesting that you make this item over other things like Shojin or Blue Buff. Those take priority for your first tier. It's after you make those items that you should look to try Chalice, as the item's effect is strong and gives good stats. Alright, next is Guardian Angel coming in at number 4. To no one's surprise, we're still advocating for Guardian Angel as a top defensive item to use. There's very few times where you won't be able to find value for this item, as it can go on your front line, your carry, or just a champion with an important ultimate that you want to cast at least once in a fight. Of course, the best champion to give this item to is going to be Gangplank. Sure, he was nerfed in 1017, but only slightly, so he's still incredibly powerful once you have him in the late game. Making sure that his ability goes off is essential, and Guardian Angel provides that opportunity. If you have any inclination during the game that you may end up with a Gangplank, try to find yourself a Guardian Angel as soon as you can. One other champion that we want to point out for Guardian Angel is Riven. The meta will determine her value, but since she was buffed, it's possible that she returns to the front line for sorcerers. Having Guardian Angel on her helps tremendously in keeping her alive long enough to distract the enemy team. Look to try out the combination of Guardian Angel and Hextech Gunblade on her as well. Our next item is Titan's Resolve, which received changes in 1017 that may have reduced its value, but we're here to talk about it nonetheless, as it's the number 3 item for today's list. So why Titan's Resolve? Before 1017, it was basically an item relegated to only being used on the mech. Outside of that, you may have seen it used occasionally for various frontline champions, but it wasn't really doing much for them. It was just a minor stat booster. In 1017, the item has changed that instead of needing 50 stacks to max it out, it only needs 25. This change has 2 implications. First is the detrimental aspect. As there's less stacks now, it means you're getting less armor and magic resist when it's maxed out, as well as less damage. But it also means that since it maxes out quicker, you're getting the bonus stats earlier, making it a bit better. Basically, it may end up being a weak item, or it may end up being much more useful than it was before. Instead of it just being useful on the mech, you can now give it to any frontliner and they'll be able to actually get max stacks out of it. That said, the loss of extra stacks may have made it too weak to bother using. We'll just have to see as players try it out. Ionic Spark is up next as the number 2 item on today's list. Considering how much we've talked about magic damage today, it should be no surprise to see Ionic Spark on the list. It's an item that will benefit any build with magic damage as its focus, since it reduces the magic resist of nearby champions. Mainly, you're going to be using it to burn through the enemy front line. Another benefit, which we've talked about many a time, is that you can slam it early game and it won't dictate what build you're going. It's good in Rebels on Gangplank, or on a frontliner and Astro Sniper, or give it to Nico for Star Guardian Sorcerer. Ionic Spark may not be worth prioritizing, but it's definitely worth making when you have the components for it. And the item coming in at number 1 on today's list is Blue Buff. We should say that Shojin is also a worthwhile item to make, as it's good on champions like Janna, Lulu, and Ashe. But Blue Buff tends to squeak out an advantage because it gives instant value in the form of extra starting mana. That means whichever champion has the item is going to cast earlier in a fight, and that's almost always valuable. Of course, there are champions that it does better on than others. Teemo, for example, is going to spam cast when he has Astro and Blue Buff. Syndra with Star Guardians is basically a machine gun with Blue Buff. Given the popularity of magic-focused builds, it's likely most players are going to want a tier. Overall, it's an item with a lot of value in the current meta, though it will be difficult to procure as tiers are a hot commodity. Alright, that is all that we have for you today, folks. We hope this top 10 list of items to try out in the new meta will help you in your ranked climb. The meta is always evolving, so it's not guaranteed that some of these items will remain relevant. Let us know in the comments section below if there's any items you think should have been on the list. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.